first
70s
one
soul band.
is the annual review that Joe
Then
emailed
I
about.
play
Oh,
with-
okay.
every
And then
once in
the
a while.
second
Although I haven't
one
really played with the Foggy Roots, which is a local band.
was
I love the
under
band.
this one.
What do you play?
So those are the
Play the
two
guitar and the
Okay.
drums,
documents that she
depending
Thank you.
on-
You control them with that.
It's
Anything
really,
important in there?
I don't know, it depends on the band.
Yeah.
Like, I really like to play drums with the soul band. It's
Yeah.
fun, like, James Brown stuff, things like that. Some of the rock stuff, rock and reggae, like guitar. They're both fun. Jeff and I are starting a band called the Bog Stompers.
The Bog Stompers.
Just drums.
Just drums.
Only drums.
It's a drum band. Taiko. It's a taiko band. Taiko drum band.
That's right, yeah, that's it.
Perfect. Well, I saw it. He came in and was like, "I'll let me go find it."
So I didn't watch it, but I saw this guy where he hooked up a bunch of sensors to his muscles and was playing drums by popping his muscles.
Really?
I didn't watch the whole thing. Going, this is like way too weird, but
It sounds weird.
whatever makes you happy.
Sounds weird, Terry. What were you watching?
Say what you want.
Some of the stuff that shows up on Facebook, it's like, oh,
No, I know.
can't
You can go down the
I can't
wormhole.
unsee that. That was
Absolutely.
one of those I can't unsee it.
Yeah. Hey, is there do you have a charger that I could? How's your? Oh, you got 100%, man.
I left for the weekend. I left it at home, so it was charged.
Okay. Just remind me to give it back to you.
Oh, there's someone out here yet, but I saw Andrew.
Andy's here.
Oh, there he is. There's Ian.
Oh, is he in here?
Ian is physically on island. I saw him today.
He is on island. He's just wandering and waiting. Do you see him?
Yeah.
Yes. Everybody's here.
It's a full board.
Hi, George. Hi, Ian. Good. How you doing?
We can talk about it.
I got yours.
The annual review of the project. Oh my goodness.
Yes. Yeah, I think there might be some over there. Are those agendas over there? Ernie? Can you see?
I don't know. Ian, are those agendas extras or are they just little extras? Oh, good. Got one. Actually, I've got two. Here's another one.
Here's another one. Gifts for all.
Carry on. Number changes.
Okay, we're all set? Are you ready? Jeff, are we ready?
Whenever you are, sir.
Okay, everybody, let's get started. The Nantucket Conservation Commission special meeting for Monday, April 22nd. We are recording, so if you're recording, please let us know. And if you could silence your cell phones, we appreciate it.
Could you try to speak into your mic a little bit more?
More closer than that.
Yes, I'm having trouble hearing you and I'm walking
better?
fast.
Okay. So we'll start with public meeting and public comment for items not being heard or talked about today. Okay. And now we're going to public hearing, notice of intent. This is for the Sconset Beach Preservation Fund, 59 to 119 Baxter Road.
Mr. Chair, Commission, Stephen Cohen, I represent the applicant, SVPF.
Please use the microphone.
Absolutely, even better. Such freedom for a moment. So, I will try to be brief. We've had many months, and in fact, really many years of submissions on this project and information on this project and study of this project. But I think it really can be boiled down to a relatively simple set of issues that are in front of you to make determinations on. And the first one is, can erosion protection be presented in this location? And as you know, essentially there's a right to have erosion protection that is a non-coastal engineering structure, and then a higher level legal standard for coastal engineering structures. Clearly what's proposed in front of you is a coastal engineering structure, and I would assert that we've demonstrated that it meets the legal standard. The legal standard for having a coastal engineering structure is two things. One, you have to show that there's a pre-1978 house or structures, and two, you have to show that those are in danger. Both of those exist here, and in my short speech, I'm going to suggest that there have been two somewhat red herrings in this argument. The first red herring is the gap lot argument. All of the land in this project is protectable. And I think that is well established by the law and by under both the state and the local standards, and as established by the order of conditions and the superseding order of conditions that have already been issued for this project. There is something called a gap lot in the parlance of DEP rules, but it's not a legal term, it's not a defined term, it's not something that there's a lot of case law on, it's not something that you're easily going to find a legal standard on, and it's not something that I actually think that you need to worry about here, although we have addressed some of the questions that you asked about it. And what I mean by that is that the state law allows you to protect pre-78 houses, and the local law, bylaw, allows you to protect pre-78 houses and infrastructure. Playground or something like that, that's public infrastructure that's not protectable if it's not pre-1978, as an example. However, what we have here is essentially both pre-78 houses and public infrastructure that is necessary for the habitation of those houses: water, sewer line, and access roads. And those are not, those are essentially part of the structure as much as, my leg is necessary for a part of my body. It's not a necessary part, but it's part of it. So you don't have to decide, is infrastructure protectable under the state law and different under the bylaw? it is protectable. And the first place you can go to see that is the state superseding order of conditions that was issued when we originally started this process 6 years ago, basically says that. So what we've showed you is that the chart that was provided shows that each lot with each house and how long they are and which ones are vacant and which ones have pre-78 houses on them and which ones have pre-78 houses that were altered under your 20% rule, and then which ones have houses on them that were altered more than that. But it's basically all irrelevant in the sense that there are enough pre-78 houses on them, and to the extent that you either have vacant land or land with post-78 houses, the standard is, is protecting that land necessary essentially for the protection of the pre-78 structures on the other lot. DEP is pretty clear that they don't care about lot lines and legal ownership. They care about the area needed to protect the house, which is one of the reasons why we can put protection on empty lots that are next to houses, why we can put it on the town lot. And it is are we protecting that pre-78 structure or not? Not is it within the narrow lot lines of private ownership. So there are essentially no gap lots here, in the sense that a gap lot is something where you have no legal protectable structure on it, and where where you're not necessarily protecting the other structure on a different lot. Here, all of the lots have either that structure on them or are protecting the other lot. And I think we've provided the chart that shows that. To the extent that you were to determine that there are 2 lots that have post-78 reconstructions of pre-78 structures on them and want to consider those to be gap lots, you could, but then you're talking about 2 lots that are about 100 linear feet each within a 4,000 foot scenario, and DEP has been pretty clear that it doesn't want missing teeth in these things. It doesn't want to undermine the structure by having soft spots, and that there are different scenarios. It's not a continuum that you could take on forever. You can't have 2 houses, so that you may be familiar with Dionys. There's 2 lots that both have rock revetments, and those owners came in and tried to fill they wanted to fill a revetment of, I think it's 600 or 800 feet between them, and the commission very quickly told those owners it's too much of a gap. There's no protectable structure there, and it's a massive distance between them. And it's a good example of how you can't just take 2 things and connect them endlessly to create fill. And so in this situation, there's a lighter there's a core array between those 2 because it was such a long structure. But here, you're talking about very small gaps between clearly protectable areas, and in fact, I would assert that all of it is protectable under the bylaw. So then the question becomes, are these structures in danger? And I think we've clearly demonstrated that they are in danger because, based on storm activity that's happened in this area, once you essentially have the undermining of the toe, you can lose 10, 20, 30 feet in a storm or in a storm season, and that these structures would be long gone at that point. And in fact, some places, the road would be considered to be closed down if it got as close as 25 feet and it's maybe only 30 feet. We've been pretty lucky that the 950 feet of geotubes that have been installed have adequately protected that area of the road. But even a small amount of loss in that area would have resulted in, if not an actual breach, a technical failure for safety purposes. So we have continued the line for the geotubes essentially north and south to where the dunes have eroded and the waves run-up goes essentially to the toe of the bank, and determine that is the point of failure where you have imminent danger. That you don't have to get to the point where you have a cliffhanger house in order to be in imminent danger. It's essentially once you've lost the dune which protects the bluff, that bluff is going to then be undermined in the next large storm, and you start that sort of never-ending process of sloughing and deterioration. And we think that it is highly beneficial for the commission to err on the side of allowing more land to be retained there, because if you draw that line, the other thing it does is allow for the retainage of the bluff walk in that area and for the natural vegetation and natural shape of the bluff, instead of allowing that to be undercut, and then 3 years later we come in and ask for protection and try and rebuild what had just existed. Try to remake artificially what had naturally existed there. So if you have protectable structures and you have that danger, then the question is, are you proposing the right kind of protection for that area? And different areas of marine environments are going to justify different coastal engineering structures. Some would support what's being proposed here, and some wouldn't. If we were in other areas of the island or other areas in the harbor, you have approved different things. In some cases, you've said that you prefer rocks, and in this case, you've said you don't. In some cases, you've said that you prefer a steel wall or timbers, and in this case, you don't. And I actually think that we've reached the right decision here. All coastal engineering structures have pros and cons. The biggest con for geotubes is essentially that they're very flat, but the biggest pro for them is that they're the most adjustable and easiest to remove. And since we're going in with something that's so substantial, I think that the Commission has rightly suggested that having that flexibility is worth a lot, as long as we're not creating some kind of undue negative. And frankly, there's no coastal engineering structure that's not hard and flat-ish. So it's not as if there's some other great option that we're not doing here. And if there is some, with every option, there's a trade-off. So if we're in a situation that the coastal engineering structure is the right one for that environment because it's providing the right level of protection, not too much, not too little, and I think we've demonstrated here that we need, because the eastern end of Nantucket is essentially one of the most dynamic marine environments in the world, never mind the island, that this kind of protection is what's needed here, and that other options that have been tried over the past 25 years have failed, that this is the right way to do it. The other thing that the system that we're proposing has as its advantage is that it's relatively quick to replace it. Like if you have the sand-filled bags, although they have the advantage of providing more sand when they break open, they also take weeks and weeks to rebuild, whereas the geotubes can be covered over much more quickly. It's a more limited exercise of time and effort to push sand over to cover them, as opposed to rebuilding the terracing involved with other systems. So the speed and the protection that we're providing for here and the adaptability are all really good features. Once you have a coastal engineering structure that's not too hard and not too soft, then the question is, are you mitigating for its negatives in a way that is the most reasonable and most appropriate? And I think that we've done that here in a couple of ways, which actually brings me to the second sort of red herring that we've had of whether or not there's enough sand at the right time. And it's easy to sort of argue you want to mimic nature, but then the question is, when you're not mimicking nature, is it a material difference or not? And I think what came out of the Berman report was really, really important. Mr. Berman noted, and we totally agree, that when you have the bags exposed, that creates a negative in terms of the reflection and refraction of the wave energy, which I'll talk about in a second, but it actually doesn't pose any danger with regard to the issue of sand mitigation, that the sand mitigation issue is separate from the exposure issue. And what he focused on was that sand was about volume, not timing, or at least not that kind of specificity of timing. So what we're proposing is the highest volume of sand and the most dynamic system of any system that's not only on Nantucket, but essentially that we can find on the eastern seaboard or otherwise. And the system, in simple terms, is really, really good for a couple of reasons. One is it meets the formula that you have used and that the state has used on all permits that have been issued of essentially requiring sand mitigation of 100% of the estimated average that's going to be lost on an annualized basis. Now, usually that sand is just dumped in the ocean or dumped over the side of a cliff or spread out once a year. It's taken out and then it's done. That's what happens in in all permits that you issue and other permits, dump and go. What we're proposing essentially is to put 3 times the amount of sand from an annualized basis onto the top of the geotubes where it would be out of the range of most storms, but easily accessible to be in front, and that there would be approximately 1 year's worth of sand, or storm season's worth of sand in front. And to the extent that sand is washed away less than the annualized amount, more would be contributed at the end of the year to make sure that we hit a minimum, but that we're not, but that we have a minimum, we're allowing the sand to be taken out at the rate that nature seems to want to take it out. So you would have instead of the current system, which basically proposes 150% no matter what, and what we found is that it's piling up and piling up because the nature hasn't wanted it for the past few years. Instead of mitigating by just having that extra 50%, what we want to do is have the 100% standard and then have 3 times that amount available, so that it both reduces the amount of recontribution of the sand to from the top, and speeds up the ability to get it over faster, but also has it quickly and readily available. So, and if you wanted, we could, there's space to store more. The 3 is not a max. I mean, the 3 is a good number, but if you said you wanted 4 years worth, we could do it. You know, the more we store down there without getting kind of crazy, makes it easier to get at pushing it over. So that's one issue, is that we're proposing sand mitigation both in an amount that meets the standards and in a form that makes it really quick and fast to get it in the right place at the right time. We're also proposing other changes to the process that I won't go through all the details, but essentially that enable us to get it there faster than we have before, based on some lessons learned over the past 6 years. The other thing that comes out of the Berman report that I think is interesting or really important is that he noted that there are 2 negatives that he noted. One was that, are you producing enough sand to maintain the beach in long-term view, which we entirely agree is an appropriate standard to be looking at. And he frankly questioned it. He wasn't sure if we could pull it off, because it's a lot of sand and it's a long time. And we totally agree, which is why we think that the sand should be monitored, and all of these transects should be monitored all up and down the beach, and that there should be failure criteria to watch for speeding up of erosion and for loss of beach, walkable beach, not on a sort of daily basis, because of course you have loss of beach all over the place regardless when you have a big storm. But usually, it comes back within a few days as the natural process. But we want to make sure that if that there are failure criteria, so that if Mr. Berman is correct that it's going to be tough and nobody really knows if we're going to be able to maintain it, that you have already built a permit that says, okay, if there's a failure on that issue, you could either force a change to the system, or including order and removal of it. So that's one issue that he noted that we think is correct, that we feel like we've addressed. And then the other issue that he noted is that when you have a 2 or 3 day storm and those bags are exposed after the first day or so, which is likely to happen, that has an impact with the wave energy that's reflecting off that essentially flat surface. And he didn't suggest that the lack of sand contribution at that time was a problem, but he did suggest that the wave energy coming off those bags could potentially be at that time enhancing the erosion in those areas. And what we see there is, in the middle of the system, there's scour at the bottom. So that will actually make the beach look like every other beach everywhere, where you have, 8 feet of loss of height of the beach goes out, and then within a few days it all fills back in. And that seems to be the pattern that we're seeing here, that in front of the geotubes, there's massive loss, and there's massive loss everywhere else, and then that fills back in. But then at the ends is where you see, scour and flanking and other issues that are sort of unique to the ends. Obviously, there's no such thing as a coastal engineering structure or even non-coastal engineering structure that doesn't have ends, and ends are always where you have your most problems, which is why we're proposing to adjust the design of the returns to try to mitigate that, because we saw what happened with the last design that we had, where we had an end, the 2 different ends. One was designed essentially on what we thought was a better way to do it, and the other end was designed to try to work around the clay head that previously existed there, and that end was too sharp and too tight and didn't didn't work well, and unfortunately, we wouldn't want to make that mistake again. And going forward, to make sure that the end is designed in a way that mitigates the concern of having flanking and scour at the ends. So if you are mitigating to the highest extent possible the impacts of wave energy at the system, and if you're mitigating to the extent, the highest amount possible with sand contribution to stop sand starvation, and you have a monitoring program in place to make sure that it's working, and you have failure criteria in place to make sure that if it doesn't work, that you have the ability to either make adjustments or to order the removal of the system, then I think that you have a system that both meets the legal standard and a system that is a responsible exercise on what is going to be a long-term, long distance and long time system that we want to make sure we get right. And that's why we think that we've also suggested, and I won't go through all of them, the details, but adjustments to the information that's being collected so that we're collecting the right kind of information at the right times and the right ways. I think that we've learned that some of the information wasn't being collected either the way it had been intended or the way it was wanted or the way it was more useful, and some of it was not at the right times, and some of it was too many times. And so we have some adjustments to try and make sure that that's the best information possible instead of just a flood of information that's not as useful. So I think that's basically where we are, that this system is something that nobody really wants. It's expensive, it's controversial, it's something that everybody wishes we didn't have to do. But at the end of the day, it's either installing a system like this or abandoning essentially Sconset. And we've made the decision to go forward and ask you to, within the law and the local bylaw, the state law and the local bylaw, to approve a system that hopefully will provide, for many generations to come, both protection of these historic homes and protection of a walkable beach for the community. And I think that we've done that, and then, frankly, I look forward to coming in later to make sure that we have the ability to try and enhance public access and those kind of things once we've provided for stability. And the last thing I want to make sure is that, you don't have to make a decision based on whether or not you like this. Nobody really likes it. And you don't have to make a decision on whether or not you think it's going to work because, forever, because that's not the question in front of you. What you really have to do is make a decision based on whether or not we're meeting the legal standards and whether or not we're meeting the standards within the Act. And the Act basically says that we have to ensure the bluff's ability to protect against storms. And that's one of the things that we're doing here, is helping the bluff from being undermined during storms. And so we don't intend to submit any more information. We're happy to answer questions, but I think what would be really helpful is if we moved into the order of conditions section of your hearing, so we can start determining whether or not, where you are on things. Our preference is to close the public meeting. If the board had a specific reason to keep it open, we could certainly consider that, but our intent is to request a closure of the public meeting. So I think I'll end it at that unless there are questions.
May I ask a question of Mr. Pucci?
Please, go ahead.
George, can I ask you a question? George, do you agree that the roads and utilities are not public infrastructure, but are indeed more a part of the homes?
Is this on? Yes. Oh, great. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission. George Pucci from KP Law Town Council's office. In response to Ernie's question, there's a couple of main highlights that I wanted to get to, and it doesn't answer that question, but it sort of raises the issue along the lines that you've asked. And before I answer that question, I just wanted to note to the Commission, at the last public hearing session, and I had to catch up the last time to review, and Deanne provided a lot of help on reviewing the two meetings that I had scheduling conflicts on. So I'm up to date as to everything that's occurred during the hearings. there were a number of legal issues that came up, one of which I talked about, and we talked about potentially receiving town council opinions on those issues in writing. And then in preparing for this meeting the last couple of weeks, I sort of, not only was I reviewing the issues that were before you in this hearing, but also in connection with the history of this project, and also with respect to our role with the Conservation Commission, particularly over the last 9 or 10 years since we've become town council to Nantucket. And as most of you know, I personally have handled quite a bit of litigation on behalf of the Conservation Commission over the past several years, both at the trial court level, including a trial for a regulatory taking damage case, as well as appellate cases where somebody seeking a permit appealed your denial of that permit. So as I was reviewing sort of my history of involvement with you, I became a little bit concerned about serving as sort of providing legal opinions either for or against a particular project. Really, there are some legal issues that have been noted during your process that really would be more appropriate for the project proponent to provide legal support for. And also, if there's a project opponent, to have they have the opportunity to respond to that, those legal issues that are raised or argued. There was a supplemental report last week which kind of summarized other information that was in the record submitted by Epsilon about, the lots at issue that are at issue in the expanded project area. That's informative, but it doesn't get into some of the legal issues that you've asked about. And so now I'm kind of getting closer to Ernie's question. When I look at this just overall, so anyway, and before I get to that, so talking about my, advocacy on behalf of the Conservation Commission, I feel somewhat uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, providing legal opinions, before you've had any sort of deliberations or really kind of wide-ranging discussion amongst yourselves in open session about your leaning on this particular project. In the event that, some type of appeal or litigation results from a permitting decision with respect to this issue, I would envision providing advocacy on behalf of the commission, as I have done many times over the past 9 years. And I would note for the record as well, and Jeff has monitored the opinions as well, I've never lost a Nantucket Conservation Commission case. and that's not, as much about the quality of my advocacy, although I like to think that, I do somewhat have some relevant experience in this area, but it more so is a compliment to the commission about the careful way that you analyze these projects and apply performance standards. And I have found that typically Jeff will provide decisions to you based on a consensus that you've reached that are very defensible in court, including the defense of a case where people sought several $100,000 of damages against the town based on one of your decisions, which ended up in the town's favor. So the long and the short of it is any type of written legal opinions, I would like to suggest respectfully that to the extent that there are unanswered questions on legal issues by Conservation Commission members, the first place that a legal opinion on that issue should come from should really be the project proponent. Having said that, so I wanted to address a couple of the big ticket items that really I saw, not getting into performance standards or the merits or, for or against this particular project and the proposed mitigation and all of that they're proposing, but kind of the threshold issue about how you would analyze this project. And I looked at the DEP superseding order of conditions from way back when. And there are actually a couple of statements in there that I don't know where they got the legal authority for it. You know, and one of them goes to this issue about protecting a lot, protecting infrastructure to protect a lot. And, you know, I know that the state doesn't protect infrastructure. So if you look at the regulations for Coastal Bank, and I know you've looked at them many times, but just focusing in, no new coastal engineering structure shall be permitted except when required to prevent storm damage to buildings constructed prior to 1978, including reconstructions of such buildings subsequent to 1978. Then you're comparing that to your regulation. Your regulation provides no new coastal engineering structure shall be permitted to protect structures constructed or substantially improved after August 1978, except for public infrastructures. So the first thing that I sort of note looking at those two things, I spoke to Jeff about this before your hearing tonight, and I know we've talked about this issue before, is a local bylaw and regulations, if authorized by that bylaw, can be more restrictive than the Wetlands Protection Act. But you can't have a bylaw and apply it and allow a project that's less restrictive than the Wetlands Protection Act. In other words, if something would require permitting under the Wetlands Protection Act, you can't permit that under a less restrictive regulation and bylaw and then sort of forget about the issue about the required state approval. Really what you have to do is apply what would be the more stringent requirement. If you look at protecting public infrastructures, really that appears to be a less restrictive provision than is provided in the Wetlands Protection Act, because the Wetlands Protection Act provides, or the regulations protect only pre-78 buildings and reconstruction of such buildings. It doesn't protect infrastructure. So query whether you would be able to permit the structure or permit it in the area of lots that are only involving quote unquote public infrastructures versus pre-78 buildings. You know, unless SBPF has, you know, strong case law, or either administrative case law from Mass DEP or you know, state case law on the issue, I would say that your analysis under this should really be without respect to public infrastructure, because that would be less restrictive than is provided in the Act. So I would be going under the standard of, is the coastal engineering structure required to prevent storm damage to buildings constructed prior to 1978, including reconstructions of such buildings? Then, ironically, in the same sentence of the regulation under your local regulations, you appear to be more restrictive than the State Wetlands Protection Act regulations with respect to structures constructed or substantially improved subsequent to 1978. Now, where I just said that you can't be less restrictive than the Wetlands Protection Act, as you know, you can be more restrictive than the Wetlands Protection Act. So in that very same sentence, where in one respect you're arguably less restrictive, in this respect you appear to be more restrictive because one provides reconstruction of such buildings, and that would imply, again, I've spoken to Jeff, I think your customary practice is reconstruction means some type of reconstruction of the pre-existing structure within that footprint. Then your regulation talks about substantially improved. Substantially improved, I would not read saying that's a reconstruction. I would say substantially improved would be some type of expansion of the footprint or bells and whistles that aren't on the original pre-78 structure. You know, and again, this would be something that really, the analysis should really be coming from the project proponent. And then finally, I'll get to Ernie's question, you know, last but not least. And this is where I think I was questioned one of the statements in the DEP superseding order of conditions was where it talks of, if you're talking about protection of a building constructed prior to 1978 or reconstruction of such building, is that limited to the building itself, or does it include infrastructure leading to that is required for the building, or public utilities that are required to inhabit that building? Again, this should really come from the applicant. Is there legal support to say that not only under the State Wetlands Protection Act regulations are we entitled to prevent storm damage to the building constructed prior to 1978, but we're entitled to protect infrastructure or public utilities necessary to have that building be occupied? That's something that I have not seen addressed, and maybe I've missed it in the record, but I don't think so. And I really think I would suggest, and again, the applicant is in control of this proceeding at this point in terms of being able to insist upon you closing the hearing. But I would recommend, especially to the applicant, I'm fairly certain you would follow my advice about this, is that really the public hearing should be left open so that the project proponent can submit some legal analysis and authority on these issues that both you've asked about, Ernie, and also that I've raised under looking at the State Wetlands Protection Act regulations versus your local bylaw regulations. So I would say that there should be a further submission on it. And they don't have to do that. They can insist to close the hearing, and then you would have to, issue your decision with the applicable time period, at which time then, we would decide based on deliberations about what further legal opinions you may or may not want in support of whatever your decision is going to end up being.
Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Thanks, George.
Mr. Chairman, if I may provide some brief response commentary to the previous discussion here. My name is Dwight Dunk with Epsilon Associates, and in terms of the closure with, in terms of Attorney Cohen, we have presented into the record how the project has been designed to meet the performance standards of the wetlands protection regulations for Coastal Bank. Without getting into every single performance standard, which we did earlier in the process. The two biggies are because this is a coastal bank that provides storm damage protection of the land from wave action, and as a sediment source. The basic project purpose is to protect the bank from erosion from wave action. And then the sand template mitigation program is to mitigate for and provide sand to the littoral system that would otherwise be provided by the bank behind the protection. So in terms of those performance standards, we've identified that the project meets those standards. The discussion of the pre-78 homes, we've had several submissions of that, and what we provided last week in the letter dated April 19, which was not any new information, but it was basically a reframing of the information in terms of length as opposed to lot count, which was provided in the past. That was part of the discussion at the last hearing. And with that, the vast majority of the length of the expanded project is to protect pre-78 homes, both as defined in the local bylaw and in the state regulations. There are a number of vacant homes, 612 feet, 5 properties of vacant homes, which under the local bylaw is proposed to protect the infrastructure of the road and the infrastructure within the road, sewer, water, electricity, all of which are required for homes to be habitable. And then under the local bylaw, we have the two lots, which are total 205 feet each, not each, total that one, each about 100 feet. 8% of the total length of the expanded project are what is commonly used for as gap lots. And those are lots across which a CES is needed in order to maintain a contiguous CES to protect otherwise allowable and protectable structures and infrastructure. And for lot 81 to the north is a couple of thousand feet of protectable homes and infrastructure. There's about 500 feet between 81 and 69 that are all pre-78 homes. And then south of 69 are pre-78 homes. So filling in that gap, so to speak, is needed across which to protect those otherwise protectable structures and infrastructure. In terms of the evaluation of the lots or the length of the project to protect infrastructure, I think we addressed that in this letter submitted on Friday, where the vacant lots, 612 feet, which is 24% of the length of the project, is clearly allowed under the local bylaw to protect the infrastructure that's needed to make the pre-78 homes habitable. Under the State Act, the DEP, in issuing the superseding order of conditions, basically stated that for the about 900 feet of project that we call the existing project, there was a number of lots that they allowed the three-tier system to be installed, and then the subsequent order of conditions issued by the commission for the fourth tier. But those three tiers were allowed by the state across vacant homes, vacant lots. And they said in parentheses, infrastructure, public infrastructure. What we're reading in that is they've set a precedent that they allow for the protection of infrastructure in accordance with 310 CMR 1030 subsection 3 to maintain the habitability of pre-78 homes. If you protect a pre-78 home, can't get to the home, can't heat the home, can't have potable water in the home, can't have adequate sanitary system in the home, it's not a habitable structure. So without being able to protect the infrastructure to support that dwelling, it's otherwise not protected. So I think the precedent that DEP established, the standard they established in the superseding order of conditions, allows and supports the town's infrastructure protection standard within the state regulations in order to protect pre-78 homes. And I think we've stated that in our letter of last Friday. And that's the standard that we've think should be applied to the expanded project, because that's the standard that was applied by DEP for the existing project.
So can I ask a question? Is that all right?
Yeah, please.
So in the superseding order, it talks a lot about imminent threat to the public infrastructure. I know when that was presented to us, we had a lot of information from our DPW about the threats to the road and what that meant, because there was an imminent threat in the amount of space between the top of the bluff and the road. With the installation of the current geotubes, that's technically been abated, and it says that in the superseding order. So I'm just wondering where our town DPW has weighed in to these imminent threats to infrastructure and where those locations are. If we're gonna say that infrastructure is possibly protectable here, what locations have imminent threat And again, has our DPW weighed in on what that is, where that is, what infrastructure might need to be moved. I'd like those, a little more detail there.
Well, I think that information is actually already in the record. The location of the road relevant to the houses and the edge of the bluff is in there. The location of the water lines and sewer lines is in there. The DPW itself hasn't taken a position. I think Rob McNeil, to his great benefit, has avoided participating in this. Kara Buzanowski did not have that benefit. She spent, weeks of her life. I'm sure she'd rather get back participating in this process. And I think it was right for the town to take a highly active role in the initial process, and right for the town to step back here, because the expansion is more about the private homes and less about the imminent threat to the road where the vacant lots are. But I don't know that. I think all the information that you're asking for is in the record, and we don't necessarily need the town DPW director's opinion on it. If you'd like that, we could provide that. But I do want to back up a little bit to what Attorney Pucci said, and essentially agree with George. I think that he's right both in not falling into the trap of taking sides during the hearing, and I think he's right in pointing out to you that your bylaw and the state law are different. And I think it's really important to note that essentially you can't and shouldn't interpret your bylaw as if it's invalid, right? So if your bylaw says that you can protect public infrastructure, you can't suggest that your own bylaw is illegal and should be read so broadly as to be beyond the scope of the state law. So if you reverse that and you say, okay, how could we interpret that to be within the scope of the bylaw, then I think you can only say that what it means there is public infrastructure that is protectable under the state law, which essentially is infrastructure that is part of and essential to protectable structures. I think that's really the only way that you can read it, because if you read it the other way, it's illegal or it's invalid outside of the scope of the state law. And I think that the evidence that you need to find that as reasonable is actually in the superseding order of conditions, in which DEP essentially made that exact statement, that protecting the access points and the water and the sewer for these homes is somewhat equivalent to protecting those structures, that they're necessary pieces of it, in the same way that you would protect a well or a septic system or something like that was smaller, more compact, but necessarily part of this. So the DEP order and your order both already address this issue. Frankly, there's not a lot of case law on this. There are some cases about it, but most of the decisions on this are orders or superseding orders that have been issued, essentially granting permits for this kind of thing, that say you can protect this house and you can also protect a gap lot, or you can protect land outside of the legal lot lines. There's a recent case in which there's a revetment that doesn't go all the way to a property line, and then someone wanted to bring their revetment to the property line, and they got permission to actually extend onto the neighbor's lot to close the gap, because it didn't make any sense to have that gap in between them. So there's many orders that allow this, but not a lot of case law that sort of where a court has determined what the legal standard is. If there was, frankly, we'd have it in front of you, because it would be super helpful. But I think really the issue of whether or not the state thinks this stuff is protectable is in the superseding order, and it is in your order. And you don't have to go beyond the scope of the law in order to reach the determination that we're asking you to reach. You can determine that some of these homes are pre-78 and that other lots are protectable to protect those homes or as gap lots. So if you feel that you're more comfortable with that, then extending to the necessary public infrastructure, you don't have to go that far, although I suggest that you have the legal authority to go that far, and already have, and the state already has. So I think that's where we are. If town council or the commission really wants more on it, I certainly would be happy to provide more on it, although I think that the information before you and the ability to make the decisions that you could make is also in front of you. And I see George has risen, so I don't want to.
I just, I'm not, it's not like a tit for tat or to disagree with Steve, but it's something I spoke about with Jeff too, because I was concerned about that, about protecting public infrastructure, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff. I think we were in interpreting the regulation so that it is in fact valid, so that provision wouldn't be stricken. I think there would be instances where you would have coastal bank protected under the bylaw, which wouldn't qualify under the act, right? So then you could protect infrastructure in that instance.
Correct. I think when we talked about it, I think if you had a situation where you had a town-defined coastal bank, that you would be able to apply that performance standard in its entirety. But if you had a state-defined coastal bank that was also a local coastal bank, that you would have to use the more restrictive of the two. And I think that's how we've applied that in the past.
Yeah. So that that's troubling on that issue, and it's still, there's still a troubling aspect about Ernie's question again about protecting infrastructure related to the pre-78 building. I really think you need some support for that before you could find that, and that was, I was again a little. I read the DEP superseding order of conditions, and difficult facts make difficult law sometimes. And a superseding order is not law. It's not an administrative case law or anything like that. Something that would be of persuasive value to you would be administrative case law issued by Mass DEP, like when there's an appeal of an order and then it goes to an adjudicatory process. That would be something of persuasive authority. There's a couple of statements in the superseding order which I don't know where they get the basis for it, because where it says about protecting in one area where they're protecting infrastructure as opposed to the pre-78 building, I don't know where they're getting the support for that. And the other one thing that's troubling about the DEP order, somewhere along the line, unfortunately, it's just the way things go in life. There was a lot of, issues related to this project one way or another, and DEP, issued an order, in a certain way, and it clearly talks about relocating the roadway during a 3 to 6 year period. If you follow the letter of the superseding order. If I'm a Martian and I come down and I know nothing about Nantucket or any history on this, and I only read the superseding order, I would ask as an alien, have you relocated the road yet? And so, and again, and that doesn't mean that there aren't other valid agreements in place, and clearly there were discussions and negotiations going on, and SBPF has lived up to their requirements with the town about waiting until when they applied for the expansion project and all of that. But it's difficult to cherry pick parts of the DEP superseding order to support this project, because it really is not consistent with it. They're clearly saying okay, got an emergency situation, we're allowing this, and we're going to have this 3 to 6 year period while you relocate the road. So maybe they would think of it differently now. I don't know, but that's clearly the provisions of this order. So that's why I think it definitely, I think would serve the commission well if the applicant were given an opportunity to kind of look at these issues in a little more detail and say, okay, here's how we're seeking the permitting for this project, and here's the case law or persuasive authority in support of that position.
Thank you.
So I do want to address a couple of things that, through you, Mr. Chairman, that George said. And again, I don't necessarily disagree with any of it. I think I definitely agree that, difficult situations make difficult laws, and that if you look at the DEP superseding order from the emergency situation, and then look at the subsequent DEP order and Concom order, that provision about protecting the road gets scaled back later in the subsequent order, which I think, you have to look at the two together. And you have to look at the alternative access agreement that's been put in place since then, which at the time DEP issued that, nobody really knew what the facts on the ground were going to be for the engineering and stuff there. But I just want to, so I agree with also, what George and Jeff said, that there is a factual situation in which you could have public infrastructure protected under the local bylaw and maybe not need a state permit because your bylaw has defined a bank or whatever as being something where a local permit is needed but a state permit isn't needed. But I also think that you could interpret that infrastructure as being definitional about aspects of the structures as well, which is what DEP says in its orders, essentially, that you can protect these structures, and then you can also protect land necessary to protect the structures, and you could protect land necessary to protect the integral parts of it. I mean, the whole point of the initial order was to prevent a failure of the road that would have resulted in loss of water and sanitary facilities and access for these houses. However, if you don't have to say that you are protecting public infrastructure. You can say that you are protecting these structures and their necessary facilities, or that you're protecting the land around them to the extent necessary, either as just land around them necessary to protect the structures, or as gap lots. And there's vast history and case law on those as being acceptable. So I don't want you to feel painted into the idea that you have to make some 30-foot leap across a canyon in order to get this done. I think you have several options in front of you, and in fact you've done them already, and DEP has done them already. And I'll remind you, I'm sure you know the process, but I want to remind you that when you issue this order, it also gets reviewed by DEP. So if you issue an order that's inconsistent with state law, DEP can ding it, or someone can appeal it. So it's not as if you deciding that you want to rely on what I'm asking you to rely on puts us in a situation of it just being out there. It can be appealed and it can be reviewed. And I'm sure George can give you many instances of DEP telling local boards that they've exceeded their authority. In fact, it was on Plum Island, they recently did it for coastal engineering structures that the local community wanted and the board approved, and the state said, nice try, but no thanks. We're not going to, you've exceeded your authority. So there's not some, it's not as if there's no checks and balances here if you decide to go forward with what we're suggesting. However, if you want more legal memos on this, we can get you more legal memos on it, but I'm not sure that you need them in order to move forward.
I have one of the questions I was going to ask.
Sure.
Actually, you had mentioned that you had been talking to DEP in your letter that you
Speak to the microphone, please.
You had mentioned that you had talked to DEP. In talks with DEP when you were talking about your mitigation.
Yes.
And stuff. But do you have written information on that, or was that just discussionary?
Yeah. So.
I mean, I'd be curious of any points that you're saying DEP has talked about it.
Yeah, I don't want to suggest that we have any pre-approval for anything, but we did float the idea of adaptive of the adaptive sand mitigation, in a meeting, and it was, verbally accepted as reasonable. But I can't assert that DEP has approved this. We certainly don't have a written memo acknowledging it. It is, something that they would have to take up on review of an order or issued by you as to whether or not they'd find it acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, we're always trying to figure out what DEP is thinking.
Yeah,
it really has a lot to do. It has a lot to do with our decisions.
Andy, you really got to
go into this time.
And they don't give advisory opinions. Right?
Up a little bit.
Okay, I'm sorry, everybody. The microphones are terrible here, I guess.
Yeah.
It just seems, from a legal point of view, we're trying to I mean, from a decision point of view, many of us are basing our thoughts on what the legalities are, and these guys have, you know, thrown their weight around with us before, so we know we want to appease them or follow their lead. But and it's true, the letter does say it's a temporary, and with the understanding that the town was going to relocate water and infrastructure, and you pointed that out. But so we're just trying to get a feel of what they're thinking here too, because they don't want to give us any points before we make our decision.
Yeah, it's my understanding that DEP is not in the position of providing advisory opinions before you've issued a decision, and that unfortunately the way it has to work is that you would issue an order, and if DEP found that you were, you know, beyond the scope of where they would find acceptable, that they would then quickly tell you that. Is that right, George? Is that consistent with your understanding of the process?
Yeah, they tend to not want to give advisory advice, but you know, on this, I think it's worth a try, maybe a call from Jeff, and you know, just their thinking.
I think we tried that one.
I will affirm that I've spoken to DEP about this project, and they said that they would hold their opinions until there was an appeal,
Right.
if there was one.
Thanks, guys.
They're smart.
It's great. Yeah.
So I think that there's a valid basis for you to make, more than one valid basis for you to grant the permit the way we were asking for it, and that if in fact we're entirely wrong on that, then either DEP or an appellant would have the basis to assert that. So I think we could move forward. We could provide you more legal frameworks for it, but I really don't know that trying to give you a legal brief is going to make the decision for you.
Well, if I may address that, Mr. Chair. Actually, I'm addressing you, Mr. Chair, which is, it seems to me that Town Council has advised us that we have that in writing from the appellant. So, or did I misunderstand? Because
Yeah, just be sure to call them the applicant. No. We're not assuming any appeals here.
Well, we will commit to getting you a legal opinion on that issue. I don't anticipate that it's going to be, you know, glaringly clear on one side as much as we wish it would be. But we can certainly get you something that we think will be legally substantial for you to make a decision and as requested, if that's what you decide to do. Because of the timing of all this, I would ask you to not necessarily hold off on moving forward while we put that together for whenever your next meeting is.
Okay. Well. Well, we'll see what the rest of the
Couple
board.
questions.
Other questions.
I know I don't normally ask questions, but I'm going to.
Do we have other questions from the commission?
I just have two quick ones.
Oh, please do.
Since we've brought it up a couple times, and since we're going through it, I just want to make sure that we included everything that we had talked about last time and this time that had been raised that we had asked kind of town council opinion on. Because I don't want to get one brief from the applicant and then say we need a second or a third one. So one of the issues that came up last time that we talked about a little bit, and the superseding order I know talks about it in the original decisions, also contemplate the alternative of relocating structures. And at the last hearing, just from my notes, it was brought up that a couple of the lots, I think 3, have common ownership on both sides of the streets, on why relocating to that wasn't either reasonable or considered as part of the pre-78, post-78 eligibility analysis. Maybe the basis for that coming through would be nice, because that was asked at the last hearing. And then since it came up today, and not to throw a monkey wrench into it, but since we were talking about the an essential public utility statement in the superseding order, it may be interesting to include the second part of that sentence where it had the set time frame. And if you guys feel that having a time frame for an installation for relocation or upgrades to those things takes away the need for a coastal engineering structure that was allowed in the earlier part of the sentence, the way it's phrased. It's just a complete statement. I want to make sure that we're addressing the whole statement and not a fragment and then leaving out the second part of the fragment. If that makes any sense to what I just said.
Yeah, it does, Jeff, and I appreciate you wanting to get everything done, without going over and over and over piecemeal. I do think that one of the problems with the superseding order was that because it was done in a vacuum as to how the utilities works, there was this idea that maybe the road and the utilities could be just relocated and it would resolve some of the danger. And I think what we've figured out is that you can't really do that there's no place to put them. There's no, you could slide them 10 feet, but that's not really solving your problem. But we can address for you in writing the idea of justifying protecting the pre-78 structures, protecting vacant land, and protecting necessary infrastructure in writing, and we will address for you in writing the legal basis of whether or not it is, can be required or it's reasonable to ask someone to relocate the house as a way of protecting it, both, not just on the lot, but across the street onto a different legal lot. I think that would be quite a stretch, but we could certainly address it for you in writing. And of course, as you noted, that's only available, in 1 or 2 cases, not.
Yeah, that's not overall.
It just came up and was on my list of questions for George. So just wanted to make sure that again we're not leaving things out and get stuck with something else next time we're talking.
Okay. Well, we could provide a legal memo on those. I'm sure you'll find it fascinating.
Always.
Okay.
Answer everything for us.
I have a comment.
Please.
With the moving the public infrastructure, as I recall, that was the whole thing that started this thing, was to give the town time to move Baxter Road and the public infrastructure. And then to come in later and say, oh, but we can't do that. I think, isn't that called a bait and switch? Which I feel like I got taken.
Well, Ernie, with all due respect, I think that is, there's a distinguishment between the emergency permit that was issued and then the regular order of conditions that was issued, which is not about dealing with the emergency situation, but was instead a 900-foot essentially pilot program to see before there was a longer project what the project would look like. And I think it's really important to distinguish between the 3 tiers that were approved under the emergency order and the larger project that was not approved under those same circumstances or legal underpinnings. I get that nobody likes this, but I don't accept that it was some kind of bait and switch as an emergency and then not. It was both an emergency and then a problem that needed to be dealt with.
Do we have other questions from the commission? Okay. I'd like to open it up to the public for new questions and comments. Yeah, mine sucks.
Be careful.
Thank you, sir. This is nothing new. It's actually something I talked to you about last week when I suggested you read the superseding order conditions, and then I know from being on board myself that you don't always get around to finding the document and the right page and get other things going on. So this is actually what Mr. Pucci has been discussing. The superseding order, paragraph 22, lays out exactly the whole issue about allowing, the paragraph above allows the geotubes to protect the structures. This essentially denies the geotubes permanently for the lots without the houses, and gives a time frame for when it has to be removed. If you go back and, well, actually, before I get to this, a lot of the arguments that the SBPF folks make
Have you
about,
introduced yourself?
I probably
Or
didn't.
Hey,
I'm very forgetful these days. I'm sorry. I'm Dirk Roggeveen. I'm an attorney representing the Quinnet-Squam Association. They own houses to the north of this project that will be impacted by any failure of adequate mitigation or overbuilding of this project that would end up affecting the littoral drift of sand up toward their beaches. And they're not, obviously, they're not against people protecting their houses in Sconset if they're legally allowed to protect their houses. Their concern is that this project will go way beyond the scope of that, and that the mitigation requirements are sufficient to ameliorate the obvious impact that this project is going to have. If you go back to, not that you necessarily want to read more, but I'm assuming it's in the town record for the last project. A lot of the arguments being made now about why this should be permanent to protect lots and gap lots and all this other stuff was in the brief filed by Sconset Beach Preservation Fund to DEP, to which SBPF filed theirs. Actually, Quinnet-Squam Association filed a brief in that too. It's probably in the record, I hope. And DEP, when issuing this, was responding to their argument. And so if you read the cover letter that came from the chief of the Wetland and Waterways program at the time, Elizabeth Cole-Harris, explains it all. It gives further meat to the superseding order of conditions, which is pretty, minimal. The funny thing about the situation before was the town of Nantucket, along with Sconset Beach, convinced the board and ultimately convinced DEP that there was an emergency, that this section without any houses on it needed to be protected because they provided access to the houses further on, and they provided utilities. And I don't believe DEP was, in addressing this, was working in a vacuum. In fact, in the prior application, there were plans that showed the road in some detail and all of where the infrastructure was, the sewer lines and stuff underneath it. Because the issue was whether you could slide how much time could you buy by sliding the road over to the edge of the roadway. But they ended up issuing an emergency permit to allow it to go in to protect the road while they relocate the road. Emergency permits aren't open-ended permits, though. I forget whether it's 30 days or 60 days. It's been a while. 30? They have to be completed within 30 days. And it was obvious to DEP and everybody else, there was no way, having issued this permit, that they were going to relocate the road within 30 days. And so when it finally got to the point where DEP is addressing it, there's no mechanism to take an emergency permit that's there to protect public safety and extend it. They say, they issue an emergency permit, they say file a notice of intent. If it doesn't meet the criteria, you can't issue the notice of intent, but you don't necessarily want them to take the bags out and have the emergency reoccur right away. And so I think part of the reason this is a little bit sometimes at odds with itself is because they were fudging it. They were trying to find a way to give 3 to 6 years to the town to get this road relocated. It wasn't that they were saying, "Oh, roads are infrastructure. Now we protect them." Without changing the regulations, we're going to do it in a back doorway through this application coming from Nantucket Island. So those would be the issues. And if you're really fascinated with this project and want to read more about it than you already have, you can go back and read this stuff from the last one when it got up to DEP. It's kind of interesting.
Thank you. Other question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Emily Molden for the Nantucket Land Council. We have brought to your attention a number of times over the last few months that there are performance standards that we don't believe have been met by the project as proposed in both the state and local regulations. And they include things such as protecting the coastal bank as a sediment source, protecting the interests of the coastal beach for permanent impacts for the placement of the geotubes, and also, as has been discussed at great detail, the eligibility of all of these lots for protection with coastal engineering structures. I think you've heard a case that if the commission did really want to permit this project, that the eligibility could maybe be argued in a few different ways. But I think you've also heard a pretty valuable opinion that one of the basis for doing so, which is DEP's superseding order of conditions, and some of the statements that were made in there don't necessarily have a strong legal ground behind them. We don't believe that all of the lots that are being proposed for protection here are eligible under the state or the local regulations. Initially, when the proposal was made to you, the notice of intent was submitted, the applicants recognized that this may be the case, and so you might recall that they had included a waiver request based on that fact. It was a little unclear to me based on their last submission whether they're now under the impression or proposing that they don't need that waiver for the performance standards for protection. But I think that that's one of the first things the commission is going to need to deliberate and make a determination on. Having to meet the burden of proof for those waiver requirements is a pretty significant factor. We don't believe they have met it, largely because we, as you know, think that the nourishment and mitigation that's being proposed is not adequate for the extension of this structure. So I just want to refocus the commission on some of those issues and those performance standards. And then also wanted to bring up again, I know you've had discussions about this in the past, but I wanted to bring up the sand again and the sediment source, and just again put in a plug that if the commission does end up issuing a permissive order, that it would absolutely be, I think, the responsible thing to do for you to require some form of documentation from the applicant before any work begins that they have compatible sediment in a volume adequate to provide the mitigation you're going to require for the 3-year life of the permit. Maybe not in perpetuity, and maybe it's not even the sources that ultimately get used, but before they actually install it, I think it would be somewhat irresponsible to not at least get documentation that that volume of compatible sediment is available somewhere. And then I would just like to invite Trey Ruthven up from Applied Coastal, who's come over again to make some final remarks to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily.
Good evening, Trey Ruthven from Applied Coastal. I'm not going to go through a lot of our old points, but I just wanted to comment on a few points that Steve brought up and kind of offer a rebuttal. He said the meaning of a gap lot is not important, but the meaning of a gap lot is critically important, whether you're looking at the Wetlands Protection Act and how to actually view them. DEP does not just give you a carte blanche to protect gap lots. I mean, if we did that, all post 78 houses would be fine. You just find 2 neighbors and then gap it between. There's numerous cases where DEP has turned down gap lots because they're not there to protect post 78 structures. So it's critical that, especially when we're talking about not 10 feet of a project, which may be less than 1%, we're talking about 25% of the entire project is a gap under the State Wetland Protection Act. The other issue I wanted to talk about is that, mitigation again. We talked about this, and once again, the formula is fine, but it's how do you apply that formula? And I think what we need to look at is, are they applying how to determine erosion rates correctly? And I think if you took it to the long term, that's not adequately addressing what's going on currently. I think you're under mitigating. We've already seen that the current system is giving off far more than they're actually proposing. And that's when it's not even operational. And the idea that giving off mitigation during a storm event is important, it's a complete fallacy based on physics. I mean, that sediment in the waves is actually dissipating wave energy, which is actually reducing erosion. That's the whole point of doing it. if it wasn't, why would we be mitigating anywhere? We could just, it wouldn't be important. And when we reference other projects, they're nowhere near the expanse of this project. If we're talking about a single homeowner versus 4,000 feet of beach, it's a really different aspect. But also, this project is not in a quiescent harbor. It's on one of the most eroding coasts in the Commonwealth, which is also a key distinction of why you want to be protective. It's not so much also for the project, but the neighboring properties. You can't just protect some at the disadvantage of others. That's not how the Wetland Protection Act works and how the regulations are applied. I think if you were to go forward, you really need to look at how these systems work, and are we actually getting the benefit so you can actually meet the Wetland Protection Act. They say no adverse impact, but I don't think we've done anything besides reduce mitigation volumes to prove that point, which is actually a fallacy. I mean, I have aerial photographs from the first March storm of 2018, which I think we've seen before, and you guys can look at it again. But you can see that the second and third tube are exposed, and what you'll see is that all the material sitting on top, it's not actually providing any mitigation. It's sequestered on top. If we were going to actually design a system to mitigate, that material would be designed in a different way, whether it's placed on the beaches, north or south, or some other way. But it's not mitigating. It's sequestered sand. So, once again, I kind of disagree with some of their points, but I don't think we're actually meeting the law of the Wetland Protection Act and how we're actually going about it. So, if you'd like to look at these, I'll pass them out.
Yes.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks, Trey.
Thanks, Trey. We can look at it together. Thanks.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Please.
just like to, once again, we've discussed this topic for many months now, and as we've advocated and as was supported by some of the comments by Mr. Berman, the peer reviewer, the idea that the sand in front of the tubes gets washed away during a storm is correct. That's the way it's designed. The sand that remains on top of the template is an on-site stockpile so that after the storm passes, that sand is then used to push down and recover the geotubes so that it's available for the next storm. It's not that it's there unavailable for the storm. It's there so it can be quickly replaced for the following storm. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about last March's conditions quite a bit, but the idea that the sand on top of the template is not available, it's not available at that moment. It's available for the next storm once it's pushed down to recover the geotubes as it's designed.
If you have, sorry. Unfortunately, during that March storm, you couldn't recover before the next storms. So it didn't work.
As we discussed when Mr. Berman was here, that what happens is, yes, we have different time frames that we're talking about, that during the storm, that gets washed away. There's some toe erosion that gets backfilled very quickly from the littoral system, but it's also backfilled from when the sand gets pushed off the top down the front. Number two is the ends are then maintained afterwards, but that the total volume of sand that was contributed in the sand season or sand year for 2018 that included last March was about 20 cubic yards per linear foot that was contributed off the template for that season. And, there was the sand on the template to do that. More sand was brought in during the winter. And so it met the design and the function of the template system. We've already had this discussion several times, and I think Mr. Berman responded to how the template works already and indicated that that's a good design. As we've said many times, most of the systems in the Commonwealth are a one-time annual deposition of sand, and here we have the on-site stockpile called the template that's used to recover the tubes after storms once it's safe to get out there and do that. And through the lessons learned, there have been changes made in the operations so that that can happen more quickly and more effectively than it had been in the past.
So, one thing that is really easy to do if you're opposing this project is to pick from the thousands of pages and say, what about this, what about this, what about this? And the problem that we keep saying over and over again is people looking at the emergency order and suggesting that that's really what we need to be responding to, when actually there's another order that you have issued and the state has approved that supersedes that eliminates the issue that they keep trying to make us address. This idea of whether or not the public infrastructure servicing these homes is something that's addressed in your current order of conditions. Not just the emergency order. Your order says that we are protecting the homes and the public infrastructure servicing those homes, not public infrastructure in general, but public infrastructure servicing those homes. So you have already considered it, and the state has already seen you issue that order twice. Okay, and the current order currently says that the project meets all of the performance standards and is being proposed at a shorter length than what was applied for, because we want to see how the system works and whether there are lessons to be learned before we look at a longer version of it. The current order doesn't say we're just trying to deal with a temporary issue here. The current order says that the applicant is scaling back the project and you're approving it to see, essentially take it for a test drive to make sure it's not going to be, that we wouldn't wish we had gone a little slower before. So, we keep going back and mischaracterizing this as a way to put, my client on the defensive when I think it's not actually what factually we're dealing with here. The other thing is that we keep getting the suggestion that, oh, well, you can't do this, we need the sand at this exact moment, or you need this, or you need that. The reality is that if almost anything they say is true, you can't approve any project because none of the hundreds of projects that you or other conservation commissions approve all the time meet the tests that they're trying to make us balance over the Grand Canyon here and meet. It's a false test. There's no such thing as a coastal engineering structure that constantly supplies sand at every moment during a storm. Nothing you approve, nothing any other commission approves. It doesn't exist. Okay, and yet they are approved all the time by you and other commissions as approvable. And in fact, most of them are much less. Provide a much lower level of mitigation that's proposed here. And also, we've never said that having sand in the system during the storm isn't important. I totally agree with Trey, who has a scientific degree that I can't even spell, that the sand there is important. We have already said it, and we've agreed with Mr. Berman's assertion about it. But it's the volume of the sand, not the timing. And by providing sand into the littoral system and into the shoals is what provides the sand in the water column on the second and third day of the storm. At that point, there's so much sand in the system, you don't need it from on top. We've also said that sand on top is not all being contributed to the storm, is not all supposed to be accessible during the storm. Some of that sand is so that we can cover it over later. So, they're pointing at something and saying it's not doing something it's not supposed to be doing, so therefore it must be a failure. Well, no, it's not doing what it's not supposed to be doing because it's not supposed to be doing it. The bags are supposed to be exposed sometimes. The sand is not all available every moment. So, we can constantly go through these factual and legal scenarios to show that it's either imperfect or, has flaws. But that's not the standard that we're supposed to be meeting here. The standard that we're supposed to be meeting here is whether or not there are pre-78 homes that are protectable and whether or not we're providing the type of system that's appropriate in this area and the type of mitigation that's appropriate in this area. You have already ruled that we meet those standards, and I think that you have the ability to rule again. You can do it with or without the waivers. You have options in front of you. And I hope that we can just get to a decision-making process in the very near future. My recommendation and my request to you is that we get to that process soon, because actually we could have this conversation forever and never get to an answer, because essentially your decision is what's going to get us to the answer. I think that we can get you the legal memo potentially at your when's the next regular meeting, Jeff?
Next regular meeting is
Wednesday.
first.
May.
Let me look.
Oh,
Yeah, May 1st is our next regular meeting.
I may not.
So that might be a little aggressive. That's only a week. What's after that? May 5th, 14th or something?
Our schedule's funny.
15.
Let me look.
So anyway, because I think what we're essentially proposing to come back with is a relatively narrow piece of information, which is a legal memo, and the other people can provide their own legal memos. I don't know that we need to, necessarily have a special meeting to debate those, but I'd like to have that for you in the record, potentially at a regular scheduled meeting, and then potentially we could set another special meeting for you to start discussing an order of conditions, whether that's a positive order or if you want to have a denial. But we should really set that meeting today. Hopefully after we get to the legal memos, because I don't know that you've heard anything new.
The next two regular meetings, Stephen? Sorry. The next two regular meetings are May the 1st and May the 22nd. There's a 3-week gap.
A 3-week gap, okay. When does this current commission term end?
End of June.
The end of June, okay. So we have some time, but not a ton. I mean, good if that's so what Josh is asking is if we want to give you the memo on the 22nd and also close on the 22nd or we could have a special meeting before then. That's your regular meeting, the 22nd, right?
Yes, sir.
So I don't know if they want to set a sooner special meeting. Trying to.
That's up to you guys.
I'm going to be gone on the 1st.
Yeah, I'm gonna be gone, this is probably 15th.
I think we're gonna be missing a couple people.
So the 22nd, why don't we try and close on the 22nd?
I'd be game for a regular meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we do that?
What's the feel of the rest of the board?
On.
Okay, well, tentatively, yeah, unless something comes up tonight.
So I just want to, for setting schedule, I know we still have maybe people that want to
That's
comment.
what I was about to say, tentatively.
So the regular ones again are either May the 1st, I know Ernie's already indicated that he will be away for that, and then the 22nd. So the thing with that, keep in mind, once the public hearing closes, you guys are required to issue a decision within 21 days of that closure. So if you get to May 22nd, you're going to have to get it in between there. But you can do special hearings just to deliberate the order. You can do it as part of your regular meeting. You can do it. You can start that deliberation as a part of the meeting the night that it's closed. You would have time before there's potential commissioner turnover to get that done if you closed on the 22nd.
I have a
Well-
comment about timing, if I may.
That's up to you.
Brief, please. But yeah, we're not done with public comment, so if there's something.
Sorry, Maureen Phillips. We got the SBPF's latest annual report last week, and if Greg Berman is going to be asked to provide his review of that, that's maybe something else that we need to have his opinion before you finish all your deliberations. So in the past, it's taken him a couple or 3 weeks at least to do it. So I'm just tossing that in there as something for you all to consider when you're timing things. Thanks.
So just to address that, I would expect that Greg's review and the public hearing on that would be far past June. And if the commission finds something in that process that they want to reopen the public hearing and make an amendment to some order that you issue, that's something we could do at that time. I don't know that we have to tie the two together. There's essentially a different order, and these reports are constant on this. Here's what I think we could do. We could try to get the legal memo in for May 1st, which is your regular meeting, with the idea that we could then close the public hearing then, and that would give you a time period to issue or to deliberate on an order during the month of May. Is that something we could potentially do?
You won't be there.
You won't be here on May 1st.
I won't be here on May 1st, and if I miss the meeting, I've already missed one somewhere way back when, I'd be off.
I would recommend at least one more hearing session
Yeah,
if Steve could agree to it, just in case they have questions, or it's very, it's difficult to have the hearing closed and then you can't ask anybody anything.
Yeah, so I mean, we could potentially keep the hearing open just to avoid having somebody kicked off, but with the idea that we have moved on to the order of conditions process, it's certainly not the intent to try and kick somebody off.
Should we try and do one more Monday?
I can do one more Monday. I'm not
Do another Monday.
going anywhere. Yeah.
Our regular meetings have been pretty long.
Yeah.
So
Agreed.
to try and thoughtfully look at this during one of our regular
I agree.
meetings. would be tough.
Yeah.
Plus, Jeff can find a place for us to meet.
That is never a problem.
The Monday the 12th, is that?
So, looking at May really quickly, we have regular meetings on the 1st and the 22nd. That would give us May the 6th and the 13th are 2 Mondays in between.
Are you going to be here on May 6th?
I think so, yeah.
I would prefer May 6th if that gives.
May 6th work for you guys?
Yes.
My 45th birthday, I can't wait.
Well.
What a gift.
Well.
That would be 45 again, Steve.
Okay. Does that work for everybody? Okay. So what was that, May 6th? Okay, so tentatively May.
Tentatively, yes.
Tentatively.
So we'll take care of that at the end, but
Okay.
I would still say we need to finish up with any other public comment.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure there's some more comment.
But you're gonna continue to date certain, right?
Yes, we will, once we have finished with any other public comment.
Okay.
Okay. So, is it?
So I just want to check, we're looking at continuing to May 6th with the idea of potentially closing the public hearing at that date and doing the order of conditions process deliberation during the next 21 days?
If they close the public hearing.
Yeah,
then
yeah,
yes.
right.
Yeah.
And I just want to make sure we're not scheduling that period when people are going to be away. I thought I heard a couple of people say they would be out.
May 1st.
I think we had.
On one day on.
Oh, one day, okay.
I think we have everyone here for the 6th, including town council.
Okay. So I don't know if there's more public comment, but I'd like to request that continuation.
I think there might be more public comment, but, okay. Is there other public comment? Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, I'm Bert Balkine. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a lawyer, but I wanted to make 3 points on why I feel we should deny the expansion, but continue the 1,000 feet experiment that we've had for the last 5 years. The first thing is the eye test. Where is the emergency? I'm an avid birder and beach goer. Go to that beach a lot. Don't see the erosion that's a declared emergency that needs to be mitigated with 4,000 feet of geotube. My second point is again that the 1,000 feet that is installed right now, it's been a good experiment and we've gathered a lot of data, but I think it's inconclusive. I think Trey's pointed that out, Emily and other people, that we don't know the full extent of what we're doing, and we need to measure more, take more data to really understand. One thing, Sackage Pond breached last year, and not saying it had anything to do with the geotubes, I'm just saying we don't even know the extent. And I spend a lot of time with the trustees of the reservation. I'm a volunteer there, and I see a lot of changes in the last 4 or 5 years out there. I'm not saying it's because of the geotubes. I'm just saying I've noticed we've had a lot of erosion in places that we hadn't had before. And then the third point is we have a coastal resiliency plan that's being formulated by the town, and we're trying to determine the places that we really need to put our energies and efforts, our sand, and all the other things that are needed to protect our infrastructure, and to dump everything into Sconset, saying this is where we're going to make our stand. It seems like 4,000 feet is going to take up a lot of our resources, sand, trucks, that kind of thing. So those are my points, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Did you want your thing up on the ground?
Hi, I'm Deanne Atherton from the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy, and there are a number of our team members here. We have some talking points that we've asked Jeff to project up on the screen. Please. We thought that this would be that the public hearing would be closed, so we tried as citizens and as a team to pull together what we thought were final points that we would like to make with you. And just to reiterate, we are not scientists and we're not attorneys, but we are fairly knowledgeable citizens. And it seems to us, in thinking this through, that there are three important points. One, there's clarification needed on a number of items. We wanted to focus on adverse impacts and reasonable alternatives, and then we have a closing thought. Of the clarification, there are really some important points in need of clarification, and we don't want the record, we want the record to be clear, and here are just 5 of them. The first one is the current structure was intended to be temporary. It was presented by the co-applicants as a temporary measure to abate an emergency. And the next slide is the cover of that NOI submission, and it says temporary. It was permitted as temporary by you, and it was permitted as temporary by the state DEP. I think that you have heard information to the contrary, and we just want to submit this on the record. The second point in terms of clarification is that alternate access to Northern Baxter Road is not predicated on permitting this expansion. That has been told to you 2 times, at least, that I know of. And as we understand, the Board of Selectmen and you have asked Town Council to clarify that, and we hope that you will receive that clarification in writing, because the statements that were made to you should not allowed to stand. Clarification number 3 is, to this day, the number of days that the geotubes have been uncovered since the installation was constructed remain unknown. We've been given averages. However, we have not been given the number of days or the number of tide cycles when the public cannot walk on its own beach. And we have innumerable anecdotal evidence of that. The next slide just shows we have focused on the storms, the successive storms in March, the 3 successive storms, and we've talked about how the geotubes have been uncovered. The tubes have remained uncovered. We just pulled some other slides that we have submitted to you previously. Here's one that was taken on January 9th. Jeff, the next one, showing uncovered geotubes. The next one we pulled was the following month, February. Again, random photos, uncovered geotubes. We have hundreds of photos taken over the past 5 years that we could submit to you in an archive. It still wouldn't provide a specific number of days or tide cycles when the geotubes have been uncovered. The same thing is in regard to a most important condition to the public, and that is clarification number 4. Again, to this day, the number of days or tide cycles when a walkable beach has been maintained or not maintained remains unknown. Again, we're given averages. We can't get to the beach when it's unwalkable to take photos. So in the next slide, which was taken in January 2017, we just pulled this at random out of our archive, and then you will see on the photo that follows, we know it must have been unwalkable at some point because of the rack line. You can see where the water has come up. Clarification number 5. According to testimony submitted by Applied Coastal on behalf of the Nantucket Land Council, the rate of erosion has increased since the geotubes have been installed, despite public statements made by the applicant. The next slide is a copy of a handout that the applicant gave to voters at special town meeting in October of this year. And I know it's difficult to read, but the highlighted statement says, 5 years after installation, there has been 0 erosion in the area being protected by the geotubes. The following slide shows the data, the graph of the data submitted by Applied Coastal. And again, it depicts the rate of erosion since the geotubes have been installed. This kind of contradictory factual information is unacceptable and should not be allowed, period. The next point we want to make is we want to focus on adverse impacts. It is our understanding from the previous decision by the Concom that in order to permit this, you have to find that there are no adverse impacts. We know of 4, and here they are. The first adverse impact is the public beach will narrow and eventually disappear. That's in the next slide, Jeff. That science is irrefutable. This was contained in testimony submitted by Dr. Robert Young in 2013. I was taken aback to hear the attorney for SPPF say at this hearing that one of the purpose of the geotubes is to maintain the beach. This is contradictory to all the science that we know. The mitigation discussion that I understand is not to maintain the beach, it's to replicate the amount of sediment that would naturally erode from the bluff and enter into the littoral system. Adverse impact 2. Immediately upon construction of a almost 4,000 foot, linear foot seawall, an additional 3 acres of beach habitat will be immediately destroyed. There has been no discussion of mitigation for this. It will be irreparably lost. Those geotubes are heavier than rocks, according to the project manager, as he explained in an interview with Gino early on in 2013 when the 900 feet was being installed. This fact seems to be ignored. There is no comment from the applicant about any mitigation for this loss of pristine beach habitat. Adverse impact 3 has been referenced tonight. As has been demonstrated, N-scour will continue, resulting in a need to extend the installation. This is what Greg Berman referred to in his latest written comments. It's going to happen. It was demonstrated, and it will be an adverse impact. The fourth adverse impact is that the beach will become a continual construction site. It will require monitoring, maintenance, and mitigation forever. It will require its own dedicated bulldozer, which will travel from Hoyks Hollow down the public beach to the site of the 4,000-foot seawall. There are reasonable alternatives to hard armoring almost 4,000 feet of beach, and here are 4 of them. in order to permit this project, you will have to find that there are no reasonable alternatives. I remember hearing of a commissioner say that the right to hard armor in front of pre-1978 structures is not an inalienable right. There have to be no adverse impacts, and there has to be an absence of reasonable alternatives. And here are 4 that are absent from the alternative analysis in the NOI before you. The first are the soft structures. There are soft structures that you have permitted, which are in place in front of properties below the bluff. In fact, they have been there and they have been maintained continually for the past 5 years. This would have been an excellent opportunity to measure the performance of the soft structure with the hard structure, and we could have seen how effective they were. That wasn't done. The soft structures are not considered an alternative by the applicant. It doesn't mean that it's not an alternative, a reasonable alternative. It is. The second reasonable alternative, as I've mentioned previously, as we have mentioned previously, is that the structures can be relocated westward into the town-owned road layout. Instead of leasing or licensing beach property owned by the town, the applicant could lease or license town-owned property in the road layout and relocate the structures landward out of harm's way. Alternative 3, which was not in place 5 years ago, is that there are shovel-ready plans now for the relocation of Northern Baxter Road should it be needed. The town has the plans in hand and they're ready to go. The next shows you an engineering drawing of those plans. The fourth reasonable alternative is that the planning for the relocation of the entire length of Baxter Road is now underway. At town meeting 2 weeks ago, the voters approved a capital expenditure of $500,000 to begin the planning and drawing of plans for the relocation of the entire length of Baxter Road, along with the infrastructure, water and sewer. This will probably take some time, but there's no emergency south of Bayberry. So that this appropriation from town meeting was approved by the voters. And the next slide, it's very hard to read, but it's just the working document from the Capital Program Committee that is just evidence we'd like in the record that demonstrates how the town has been moving forward and has been very proactive and forward-thinking in this regard. And in closing, we just want to share a thought with you. And that is that this is not any beach. It's a historic beach, a legacy to the inhabitants of Nantucket from the proprietors. In the near offshore is a cobble habitat, a fish nursery unlike any other, according to local fishermen. A good friend, a Nantucket native, said he saw his first whale offshore from this beach. There is a historic lighthouse perched up on the bluff above it. Many believe that this stretch of shoreline on Nantucket, which somehow has been miraculously preserved, the eroding headland is geologically significant. Scholars and visitors have come afar to see it. Many of us believe that this stretch of beach should be declared a marine sanctuary. And we agree it should. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, is there any other public comment? Nope. Okay, seeing not. You already asked for a continuation? Or?
Yes.
Oh, we have. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. My apologies. Please come to the microphone and give your name.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My name is Karen Warner, I have I'm with the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy, but I have a letter from one of our other members who couldn't be here. Would that be okay? Like a minute and 35 seconds. I swear. I know your heads are just
Okay, go right
spinning.
ahead. Go right.
Okay. The letter reads, her name is Barbara Bund, and she is with Nantucket Coastal Conservancy. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be on island today for today's meeting. I thank you for allowing me to have Karen Warner read this statement for me. I urge you to please pay very careful attention to the issues regarding sand. The quantities of sand that would be required for the proposed expansion, the quality of sand that would be available. The required quantities of sand would be enormous. In calculations that I presented to the Select Board last year, that are therefore, of course, part of the public record, I showed that using the numbers taken from SBPF records and meant to be charitable to SBPF, the current installation requires just over 1,000 truckloads per year and costs the better part of $1 million per year without considering the rising cost of sand. Using the current requirement for cubic yards per linear foot per year, the expanded installation would require over 4,000 truckloads per year for a cost of at least $2.5 million, again, without consideration of the rising cost of sand and without considering the sand required for the initial installation. I then took SBPF's estimates of the total of sand in 2 island pits from I could see March 2nd, 2018 letter from SBPF to the Concom, and calculated that such a requirement for the expanded project would exhaust the 2 pits between 4.8 and 8.4 years, even if no island sand were available to any other use during this time. Although these calculations are public record, as a convenience, we're providing you with a copy today. These calculations strongly imply that SBPF would have to get sand from other sources. If so, the quality of sand becomes even more a serious issue. Our offshore inhabitants are important. The cobble matters. We should safeguard tiny organisms living along the shore that are the basis of that ecosystem. Surely SBPF should not be allowed to take actions that would damage the near-shore environment. There are, in fact, other issues involving sand, the impact on Nantucket's roads of trucks carrying the sand, the impact of the trucks and deliveries of the other residents on the island, the impact on the other users of the sand because of the changes in cost and availability of the sand. My understanding is that these additional issues are primarily the concern of the Select Board. I urge you to pay careful, close attention to the issues of the quality of the sand and the quantity of the sand. I urge you not to approve the expansion of the GO2 project. Barbara Bund.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Another hand?
You did good. Yeah, like as you stated, a lot of that we don't have jurisdiction over, unfortunately. But of course, it's in our minds. But it's not supposed to. It's best not to be part of our considerations. But thank you.
Thanks, Karen. I know there are rules about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Arthur Gasparo for SBPF. I'd like to address one point as I've been listening through many of these hearings, and it keeps coming up for both your consideration as well as for the folks that have concerns, and that's specifically to the walkable beach. None of the beaches are walkable during the storms that we get. I monitor an awfully lot of projects. I'm out in these storms in Grundens and muck boots, and so to hold this standard and continue to raise that it's not a walkable beach during a specific period of time, when none of the beaches are, essentially, I think has to be taken into consideration, and I wanted to mention that. And I think that the photos actually show how that beach is actually passable most of the time. And while there might be a rack line from after a storm, but I think to hold a standard that says anybody's supposed to be able to go on any beach at any time, or then that this beach is supposed to be held to that, is not, I think, the appropriate way to look at that standard. And it's just during a storm, you can't go down to Nobodere and walk to Mitigation in the middle of a storm. It's not a walkable beach, and there's no coastal engineering structure. So Having that there, the sand that's contributed maintains the beach. And I won't go through all of the points, but the walkable beach, I've been listening to that come up for an awfully long time. And I just want to say that, again, not all beaches, most beaches are not walkable all of the time. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may respond to Art.
Oh, please go ahead.
Art is correct, and the agreement we negotiated during those interminable sessions over the last issue did contain the notion that these were walkable beaches during normal conditions, normal tide conditions, and did not include storms. So that is correct. But, the concern was if the beach does erode, as, was pointed out likely, then the beach may become unwalkable during normal tide cycles. And I remember that day we went down to look at the damage last spring. I remember getting chased up to the, up to the bags a couple of times and that wasn't even at high tide. So, I mean, there were periods when even under normal times, the beach wasn't walkable. Sorry.
Yeah, I really appreciate Dan's presentation. It's a lot of work there, but frankly, I'm not going to refute it. 30 pages of it, but it's a really good list of red herrings. There's a lot of questions on there that actually have nothing to do with what's in front of you, like how many days was the bags uncovered. It's not a relevant issue. It's certainly something you can ask us to track, but it's not, Greg Berman's report said the days that it's uncovered where there's no storms is actually there's no problem, right? So tracking a day where the engineer has said there's no actual problem is not a critical issue. It's an important piece of information. It's something that wasn't required to be tracked, so that's why we don't have the number. We can track it, you can require us to track it, but to suggest that we haven't tracked something that nobody thought was important, not required to be tracked, it's just sort of a distraction. And, to suggest that we really should be considering softer alternatives, frankly, if that would work, it would be a lot less expensive and a lot easier to permit, and we'd be doing it. But, it's disheartening to suggest that that's where we are, that what we really should be doing is going back and looking at non-coastal engineering structures and softer standards as if nobody has really worked through that issue before. We're so far beyond that. But, I think where we are is you've already heard arguments on all of these issues literally dozens of times, and we don't need to go back through them. We'll get you the information that you requested on the legal issues, and we'll request a continuation to May 6th. And I appreciate the commission's time as usual. And I appreciate the time and concern of the opponents. I think that the people who are concerned about this project have some valid concerns, and the community has valid concerns. And this project wouldn't be as good as it is if it wasn't being held to an extremely high level of review. And we're really glad that that is happening. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we will continue till the 6th. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
To May 6th?
May 6th.
I'm gonna run George to the boat.
No problem. Okay, so, great.
Yeah.
May 6th.
I don't even know where the agenda is.
Oh, we're not done yet, are we?
We're not done yet.
Oh,
you got
more than I know you have.
Scribble on here. That's not my notes. I got them stuff. 1 second. 1 second.
I'll still probably call you, Bill. Yeah, he's gonna text me every day. I'll put it in my calendar.
Let's see. I don't know. We didn't even have any approval minutes. We didn't have any minutes to approve. Monitoring reports. I don't think we have to worry about that since Jeff's not here. Enforcement actions, same. And reports, I don't have anything.
Can I make a motion to close the hearing? Is that okay?
Second.
Move to close the meeting.
I move to close the meeting.
Okay. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Very good.
Andy, can I get a ride?
Yeah, sure. Yes. Weird wing.
Andy. Yeah, we got.
This microphone's dead. 6, March 6th. May 6th.
The March 25th.
March, wait, no, March.
Yes, we don't
Right.
know where they are.
We don't see them.
Okay,
You didn't get them.
so those are held. Yes, everything's holding.
Yeah, we just jumped to the end.
Yeah, you gotta start shouting at your wife more, Andy.
Well, the mic's
Get some volume in there.
The mic's
I was yelling into a dead mic.
I know the mic wasn't
Like,
working.
give me a break.
So now we know what it's like at home.
Yell at your wife more. Andy, what's the matter with you? Well, mine came on halfway through, and I was like, wait, what?
Right. I think they were all off.
Am I at town meeting? Correct.
You're not lucky enough to be in the
You have a great time? I'm sure you did.
This is better than that.
Oh, it's a one good time.
Oh, God, no kidding. Get these microphones to work.
Probably the only time in the
Very-
that everybody gets to. Because it used to be Christmases, but everybody's got other in-laws and everything to go to do that. But we
I've thought that before.
Kind of Easter.
Way off? Where's the red light?
I get my fix with everything.
You were this big last minute.
We're having a family reunion June 2nd, and I'm going to see nephews and nieces I haven't seen in 5, 6 years. It's fun. Because it's all good. Family get together.
He had the red.
It's like, oh, hey, time hasn't been friendly to you. And so, like, we have a set of twins in the family that they both turned 16 today. So we had a celebration for them.
Kids left here.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was great.
We could maybe leave it over at the.
Did you get it?
Department over
Yeah.
there.
Somewhere.
Oh, it's still in front of me. Oh, you got that?
Up front. Yeah.
Did Jeff say he was coming back?
Yes, he did.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
He did.
Never mind.
Yeah. So what it's going to do is now it invites you to this. They did it like 7 pops up on his phone. How the hell did you have my phone? I didn't do it. It's like a wizard.
You are truly a wizard.
So my wife's in my hand, now you're my phone.
Hey, look, I just pulled that up.
Oh boy. Well, one good thing. This is the last time I get asked.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, well, the whole interpretation of that last DEP superseding order of conditions. I remember reading that.
That's a pretty straightforward
This
letter.
isn't a bogus or
It was a bonus order when we got it, but it's pretty straightforward there.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
so,
the whole thing was voted. I mean, the whole thing was emergency orders like this is.
yeah.
You know, it's not. Let the town pull it off.
I did actually. I think I might have.
So it wasn't dead. No, it's not dead. No, I actually thought it was. I thought. Well, I wish that but I feel that, well, I feel I mishandled it. Yeah, but I that's the good thing. So now, well, you know, he actually said that the it's going to be.
I'm sorry, Dean. I couldn't catch it.
But they didn't actually include everybody. And so it's unfortunate she called it. Otherwise it might have been through. And, but it just seemed that, you know, I guess we all thought that it was drafted in such a way that it was obvious that it didn't minor road, it's a main road. And so I was taken
I
away.
agree, I was like, something's not meeting.
Well,
That's
yeah,
where the
right,
problem is.
right. But you can't say that, you know, I couldn't.
Right.
Say
Right,
that.
and that's where, that's right, and that's where I think, we did get a little bit off, but then I think there's people that go off. I think at their hurry, they had it. And then it was.
Totally.
Like, you don't want to stop on the road.
Yeah.
So that's why I just, I was like, stand up.
Right.
And then so I went to my friend. I stand up and like, go against my mom and go.
Sensible decision.
Well, no, I would keep it going. I would like,